On Friday afternoon this week, I did something rather wonderful. I was asked to go back to one of the schools in which I had been a pupil and to chat with some students, higher level religious, moral and philosophical studies students, about a whole range of things that interested them. They were writing essays about a whole load of stuff, and they put me in the hot seat. I mean, literally in the hot seat, right in the middle of the classroom, and fired questions at me about a whole range of ethical issues. Now, I've done lots of things like that. I've been in many a classroom like that and been interviewed by people and all kinds of things, particularly when we were going through all the decision-making around same-sex marriage and the marriage of same-sex couples and all that kind of thing. So I'm used to doing that kind of thing. And often in the past, when I've been asked what I was doing, I've said, well, I'm going to a place and they'll ask me the usual questions and I'll give the usual answers. But the session this week in my old school wasn't quite like that. Some of the questions were really creative and interesting, and they actually made me think. But the underlying question behind all of the topics that came up was, how do we decide what to do? How do we decide how to live? How do we decide how to answer difficult ethical dilemmas? How do we know how to behave, to make decisions? How to be? And it was a really interesting conversation. It was a great thing to do. It reminded me a little bit of a teaching event that I used to run here in St. Mary's, which was called All You Need to Know About Christian Ethics in 6 Cartoons. Now, the congregation's changed quite a bit since I ran that, and perhaps it's something I might think about running again if people were interested. But one of the cartoons that I used to draw in those sessions was of a hand sticking out and a wrist with a bangle on it. And on the bangle were some letters. And those letters represented a whole way of decision-making that became popular with Christians, particularly young Christians, about 20 years ago. The initials on the bangle were WWJD, and they were supposed to stand for What Would Jesus Do? The idea was that if you had one of these bangles on your arm and you were in a great quandary about life, all you had to do is look at your bangle and think, what would Jesus do? And you would have your answer instinctively. And I always used to challenge that with this gospel reading this morning. Would you behave as Jesus behaved? Those bangles were very popular at that time, perhaps they still are, but I've never been quite so sure that those wearing them knew how dangerous that question could be. What would Jesus do? Well, let's take that gospel reading this morning and ask a few questions of it. How shall we interpret what is going on? If we ask ourselves, what would Jesus do as we make our way through life? Does it help us to decide how to live and how to be? The passage of the gospel that we read today carries an enormous amount of baggage, some of which isn't helpful at all. And it is a passage worth taking time over and thinking through. This is one of the passages in Scripture, and there are a number, but this is one particular passage in Scripture that has led to preaching from Christian pulpits for centuries, which carries both overtones and undertones of Christian anti-Semitism. If we were to draw a cartoon of this incident, what would we draw? It would be all too easy to draw a picture of Jewish money changers. Remember that hateful trope? Being scattered by angry, righteous Jesus with his whip of cords. And we might call that picture the cleansing of the temple. And before we knew where we were, our stereotypes would have created a very anti-Semitic image. For if you think that sweeping away the Jewish sacrificial structure from a Jewish temple that we know that Jesus visited and enjoyed visiting and worshipping in, you might well be reading the text through centuries of anti-Semitic retellings. I once went on a 3-day colloquium on anti-Semitism in Christian preaching, and it changed the way I think about the Bible and about my own preaching. And one of the things that I remember hearing there that can be summed up in just a few words was something that one of the teachers on that 3 days said. It was a Jewish professor, Amy Jill Devine, who has made the study of the New Testament her life's work. Why, she would ask, why do you Christians need to make Jewish life and worship look bad in order to make Jesus look good? And it's a really good question. And our interpretation of this and other events in Jesus' life has often consisted of painting a picture of a religious system that needed to be completely swept away. And yet that is not really true to what we hear of Jesus, who was a devout Jew, who wore a fringed prayer shawl, and who worshipped in the temple. He is not a stranger to this scene. He is an insider. So what is going on? And are there other ways of thinking about this story that might illuminate how to live and how to be? Well, let's look back at what Jesus actually says. He says, "Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." And we often hear that as a command rather than a quote. And that's something that's interesting. It's all too easy to conjure up our stock image of an angry Jesus and not remember that he's actually quoting something or alluding to something in one of the prophets, the prophet Zechariah, the end of chapter 14. In verses there, we have a prophet speaking of a time when there will no longer be traders in the house of the Lord. And Jesus seems to be recalling that phrase. Now, the traders in the house of the Lord were a long-established feature. They would have been something that Jesus and the people around him knew very well. When we hear of Jesus being taken and presented to the temple and there being 2 pigeons sacrificed, they would have come from these people. It was a system that worked. And there is no hint in John's gospel that these traders were either cheating the people or acting unjustly. When we read this gospel, that is simply in our heads from things that we have heard elsewhere. John does not describe that. The portion of the prophet Zechariah that Jesus is referring to speaks of a time when the sacrificial system would melt away because the world had changed and the way people think about the world would have changed. Instead of sacrifice being possible only in one place in the world, the prophet imagines that everywhere in the world is just as holy. Instead of sacrifices being offered and possible only in one spot, they would instead be possible everywhere. Zechariah is acknowledging the holiness of the temple, and one day, he says, one day we'll not need all of this trading because we'll see that people's homes are just as holy as the temple itself. And he goes on to say, even the very pots and pans that you cook with will be holy to the Lord, the God of hosts. It's a prophecy of the good life. And the prophet goes on and keeps giving examples. He says, even the bells on people's horses will be inscribed with the words, "Holy to the Lord." Just sit with that vision for a bit. Remember, that's what Jesus is kind of quoting or alluding to in his words as this scene is played out in the temple. Maybe Jesus isn't telling us about how wicked the money changers were, but calling us to live a life where we start to think about holiness being in every place there is. Calling us perhaps to see the world as being steeped in holiness. Planting a vision in our minds of righteousness and justice being everywhere and for everyone. So that, yes, even the bells on your horses or the bells on your bikes or the horns on your cars will be inscribed as holy to the Lord, where even the vessels that you cook with and eat with at home are just as holy as anything that we do here, because every moment, every action, every deed will speak of the grace of God. That's the world that the prophet Zechariah conjures up. And that's the vision that seems to be being alluded to in Jesus' mind. His words conjure up those verses. So what would Jesus do? How shall we decide how to live? How shall we attempt to do what Jesus would have us do? Is this about an angry Jesus tipping over the tables in an anti-Semitic cartoon? Or could it be a call to holiness, where every place, every deed, and every living thing is holy? If we can discover somehow that every place is a place steeped in God's love, and that every living thing is holy, we may find new answers on how to live.